Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of subjects that matter most to business leaders. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series. And in today's conversation, we're going to discuss Brexit. It's been 3 years since the UK withdrew from the European Union agreements. Why did they do it? What challenges have they faced? And what has been the impact of Brexit both on the UK and the EU?
You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Joining me today is Sara Murray, the International Managing Director at the Conference Board. Sara, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
Yeah. So Sara, just for, we have some listeners who are very sophisticated and know the intricate details of all this and others that don't. But so, let's just start by describing what happened with Brexit and when did this go into effect and what's changed now?
Sure. So the UK voted to leave the EU by 52% leave to 48% remain in a referendum in June 2016. And the campaign message that the country wanted to take back control of its borders, money and laws really resonated with voters. So if you think about that, that's nearly over 7 years ago that vote took place. And in 31st of January 2020, the UK left under the terms of a negotiated divorce deal, but there was a transition period. And then in December 2020, there was a last-minute agreement to avoid this no-deal scenario, which would be the worst situation for both sides, until finally on the 31st of December 2020, that transition period expired and the terms of the UK's new life outside of the EU came into force on the 1st of January 2021. Now, this is the first time that the EU bloc lost a member, and the UK is now considered a third country for the EU. So it means it has new customs and trade regulations. It's created additional bureaucracy for businesses on both sides. And most importantly, the UK gave up access to the single market and the customs union. If you don't mind me giving a little bit of context of how did we get there, I think it might just help to kind of set the scene. And if you think about during that period, so 2015, 2016, trust in government was really low. We'd had the 2015 and 16 bombings, if you remember, in Paris and in Brussels. The handling of the Iraq war was not something that the UK population was proud of the UK government. We had Syrian refugees coming into Europe and a real big misunderstanding about the difference between refugees and immigration. If you remember, Scotland did a referendum in 2014 and they lost that referendum for independence. And that meant at the time that the Conservative Party leader was quite cocky in thinking, if I put a referendum to the UK, I'm sure we can win. And they did that because of the threat of UKIP. So this rising nationalist sentiment in the country, and, populism was really on the rise. And for decades, the Conservative Party have always had this issue of Europe. There's always been a split in the party of hardliners wanting to leave and remain, as it affected Thatcher, it affected John Major, it's affected Cameron. We've had 4 prime ministers since Brexit. So, it's a big issue. And if anything, it's about the Conservative Party trying to deal with this hard right issue rather than, what's in the national interest.
Yeah. So let's pause there. So you have this situation where the UK and the countries on the continent were separate.
Yeah.
With the creation of the EU, the UK joined that, which then made it one trading bloc, but also then they went beyond the trading bloc and they wanted to pass laws from Brussels, unelected officials in Brussels, electing and making laws that then applied to UK citizens, which caused a little bit of a friction because you've got these people in Brussels telling the people in the UK what to do. And then there was the whole currency thing where, eventually the notion was that the UK would give up the pound sterling and move to the euro, and that caused friction and concern as well. So that I think so that was part of it. So you had the people who wanted to be part of all of that, and people who said no, we want to be a sovereign nation, right?
Yeah, indeed. And the real issues of the Leaver camp was, to your point, it's about this principle that decisions about the UK should be taken in the UK. It was also about, how to regain control of immigration, laws, borders. And they were also, had an issue with, if you remain in the EU, you would have no choice on how the EU decided to expand its membership. And this was a big sticking point, because if you remember the early 2000s, there was this massive process of EU enlargement where all these Eastern European countries joined the Union, and under the principles of the free movement of people, goods, capital and services, a lot of EU workers moved to the UK and took jobs in low-skilled kind of areas. And people that were less educated felt that they were having to now compete with these workers. So there was a lot of tension that kind of came from that. Okay.
So the vote happened 7 years ago. And, this was, mathematically, the Leavers won. It was 52 to 48, but that's not, that's pretty close. To say that we're going to throw this whole thing up in the air, by 2% it was really very, very, very close. But there were big differences around the UK in terms of the opinion, right? So you had some people, some areas, and so it broke out geographically, which then raises the question for those of us who were not, who did not grow up in the UK. It's very confusing. What's the difference between what's called the Commonwealth, what's called Britain, what's called Great Britain, and what's called the United Kingdom? So if you could just explain a little bit about the geography to those of us who are not as familiar, and then how do each of those pieces have, what is their view of Brexit?
Yeah. So interesting. So the Commonwealth is a group of about 54 nations, and that evolved out of the former British Empire in 1949. So there's, they meet regularly and they talk about shared economic development, trade, democracy, cultural exchange. And the Leave camp felt very strongly that this Commonwealth would be a greater opportunity to them than the EU because of historical ties, shared language, similar legal traditions, but also because some of those nations, their growth was at 4% versus the EU's 2%, right? So that was a big kind of factor in their argumentation for the Leave campaign. Great Britain is a term for England, Wales and Scotland, but the one that is the political entity is the United Kingdom, which comprises of Northern Ireland, England, Wales and Scotland. It has a government in London, and then Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland have their devolved powers and their devolved governments. So then when you then look at, okay, so what were the results and how did, all the differences kind of play out? I think the results point to a really divided country, and I'm going to explain regional differences, age, education, town versus city and race. But on the regional differences, Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain, and they're generally, more prosperous, well-educated professionals with economies linked to the EU. England and Wales voted to leave, and especially those regions with high levels of deprivation, low levels of education, and my point about high migration from Eastern Europe, they were the ones, to vote to leave. Interestingly, the older the voter, the more likely to leave. The majority of those on a pension and retired would leave. The younger the vote, remain. Full-time, part-time workers remain. Not working, leave. Those with university degrees and above remain. Those with what we would call GCSE qualifications, so just up to 16 years old, would vote to leave. What I think is also really interesting is when you look at race, the majority of white voters, and this really kind of came from England, they voted to leave. So it was a real outlet for a lot of nationalism in England that led to this result. If you were Asian, if you were African, you would vote to remain. So some really kind of interesting results there, where we're now in a situation where, if you think from a US perspective, the UK is no longer that gateway for the US to Europe. And the EU or UK businesses have, had to kind of move operations now to the continent if they want to continue, because they need to avoid all this red tape. They want smooth, just-in-time supply chains, which they just can't get because of this Brexit divorce. And I think business didn't like it. They voiced at the time that they didn't like it. They still don't like it. They were told by the Leave campaign to shut up, and they were dismissed. And what was interesting was the Conservative Party, which was historically pro-business, almost came more ideological, because again, it was about this hard right faction and dealing with that, rather than, what's in the national interest.
Yeah, and to simplify the parties, it's Labour and Tory, Tory being the more conservative pro-business traditionally and stereotypically, and Labour being more, more left of center, and so forth. And okay, so one area you did not mention is the Republic of Ireland. Can you just talk about Ireland, because we also have the issue then about the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland.
So I think this needs a little bit of historical explanation, if you don't mind me just stepping back, because it can get very technical and complicated. So I think what's interesting is the UK and Ireland joined the EU at the same time in the 1970s. So the significance is that their history was twinned. Now, Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom, but on the island of Ireland, shares a border with Ireland. And in 1998, there was this Good Friday Agreement that we will all recall that ended years of violence between separatists and unionists, those wanting to join Ireland and those wanting to remain in the UK. But in that Good Friday Agreement, nothing can get in the way of a hard border. So by both members joining the EU, that was solved because there was frictionless trade between them. And so when the UK left the EU, the issue was, well, how do you treat Northern Ireland? It cannot have a hard border. The absence of a hard border is a symbol of the peace process. So the Northern Ireland Protocol was put together, which meant that checks had to come on UK goods into Northern Ireland. And the unionists were not happy because they felt that they weren't being treated in the same way as the UK. Massive deadlock. If you remember, even the US froze talks with the UK on a trade deal until this Northern Ireland Protocol was resolved. And what we've just seen yesterday is a deal has been struck between the EU and the UK. It did get through, and it means, well, it's taken nearly 7 years. It's taken 4 prime ministers, but it now means less checks. And it now means that the EU and the UK have reset that relationship. It's called the Windsor Framework. And I think everyone's hoping that it will bring back grown-up politics and enable the UK and Europe to talk again.
Right. I think, and so it's interesting because this border issue between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland on the island of Ireland, which is what became stuck in the craw here of the Brexit process, because of the former troubles, as they were called, between the Northern Ireland folks and the Republic of Ireland, and the peace settlement. It required, as you said, an open border. So they took down all the border checks. It's wide open. I mean, you can drive right straight through from from one side to the other. And they're more economically and culturally integrated. So this was a very important piece of it. But yet Northern Ireland is part of the UK, and so therefore you have this whole different situation. And I think everybody was keen not to not to stimulate more troubles or a return of the troubles through this whole Brexit process. And it's ironic, though, but you have to understand the history of the empire down to the Commonwealth, down to all of this in order to understand the pieces here. So therefore, you come back to this geography it's relatively small in the whole scheme of things, but the differences are very, very important. I mean, you have the Scots who, have been rattling about independence, for Scotland, and so all of this kind of triggered these nationalist and regional and cultural, culture-centric tendencies here, and it's a troubling time when that happens. Yeah.
Well, absolutely, and again, since Brexit, the Scotland tried again to profit from the fact that Scotland voted to remain in the EU. Those nationalists wanted to take that opportunity and go for another independence referendum. And I think what's been interesting is the UK Supreme Court has since ruled that they cannot have another referendum unless London approve. And I think the fact that this deal has just, got over the line with Northern Ireland, one hopes that at least that kicks the can down the road about those kind of conversations. But indeed, what this did was just open up and show how divided the United Kingdom is, and that's something that is not an easy one to figure out overnight.
No, and now it looked like even though this vote was taken 7 years ago, the internal polling around the country suggested that if the vote was taken again, it would not pass, and in fact, the Remain group would win. And so there was some talk about taking another vote and changing the decision here. Where does all that stand?
Yeah, I do not think there is an appetite at all on the UK side or even on the EU side to rejoin right now. I think the UK are going to be tied into this situation for decades. I would say at least 20 years until those older voters are not there. I think the UK needs time to reflect. What I think is interesting, though, Steve, I don't know if you heard about this, that in February, there was an extraordinary and secret cross-party summit held at Ditchley Park. The Leavers, the Remainers, business, diplomats, all there to address the failings of Brexit and how to remedy them in the national interest, and a real acknowledgement that so far the UK has not found its way, that Britain's losing out, that Brexit is not delivering, the economy is weak. And they were really there to kind of talk about how can we have a conversation with the EU about changes to the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And so that is quite remarkable.
Yeah, remarkable, but quite necessary. I mean, we're running 10% inflation most recently in the UK.
Yeah.
The central bank is raising the interest rates quite precipitously. It's the UK probably is in a recession, if not at the exact moment. It's everybody forecasts it will be. So it's not a good time economically. But you have to go back to history, because the older generation, the boomers and older, are the group that remember World War II, and there's that in some ways is ancient history, but in some ways wasn't that long ago, and so you still have this friction between the continent and players on the continent and the UK, and so you can see how they want to retain their national integrity in all of this, rather than handing this over. So this is what you're saying. It's probably going to take a generation and maybe two to try to allow this time and to pass. But in the meantime, then it really means this has been a one-way trip.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. So therefore, the trade agreements that follow on to an integrated economy become that much more important. So and the initial ones, the EU, Brexit says the UK says we're leaving. The continent says, well, okay, goodbye. And so, we're not really incented to do a great trade agreement here because, a little bit of hard feelings, I guess. But that needs to also have some time for them to work out and to continue to modify, which is why this summit here that just happened is so important, because it needs, because the various factions and groups in the UK need to get together and be of at least enough of one mind that the government can negotiate with the EU. Yeah.
Well, yes, but I would say that the trade deals that have been struck, so there was one with Japan that's now been labelled a failure. Trade has actually decreased between the UK and Japan. There was a trade deal with Australia, very much labelled as it benefited Australia. It didn't benefit the UK. There are a lot of rollover trade deal agreements under the old EU terms that the UK kind of took on. Again, that point about, the Commonwealth opportunity. If the EU find it hard to strike a deal with India, which, has a very protected economy, but the, EU is a large bloc, what hope will the UK have of being able to do that as a smaller entity? So I think it's going to be very difficult. And, the UK do not have the largest negotiating hand. They won't if the talks recover or restart with the US. So I think the bubble has burst a bit about, this global Britain slogan that was painted around. I'm not sure how much opportunity is really there.
You mentioned the US, and that's interesting because, following Brexit, the view was that perhaps the UK would look west rather than looking east, and that, look west to North America, including Canada, part of the Commonwealth, and of course the US and Mexico. And so there were some predictions that, there's the former NAFTA agreement, a USMCA agreement, that they thought perhaps the UK would join. That has not happened, and it really hasn't gone anywhere, has it?
No, not at all. And this is the point of, the ability of the UK to go out on its own and strike these deals. And the reality just is, a lot of the diplomats and a lot of the civil servants are still working incredibly hard on trying to unpick from the EU. There's years and years of integration that's taking up a huge amount of time. Trade deals also take a huge amount of time. And you also need the skills within the civil servant to actually strike trade deals. And in the past 40 years, it was the EU that did all of those trade deals. So, you've also got a skills gap, going on. So, yes, the reality is it's a lot harder than originally expected.
Now, there was part of this nationalist view, which resulted in Brexit, was the desire for separate currencies and the pound sterling, to retain the pound sterling and not go over to the euro. Talk about the importance of that, and what were the fears of integrating with the euro as a common currency?
So I just want to remind listeners that the UK enjoyed a unique and privileged position in the EU. They had an opt-out of the euro currency. So they never adopted it. They continued to use the pound. And one of their main arguments in getting that opt-out was they wanted, they had this desire to retain control over monetary policy, have a separate currency rather than be bound by the Eurozone's monetary policies. But the tabloids kept stating tensions in the UK that they would have to join the euro. Legally, they always had this opt-out. So the case also for joining the euro was quashed, especially after the euro crisis. And so I would say that this issue was more a symptom of the tabloid hostility that led to the leave result. And let's not forget that British tabloid hostility to the EU has been going on for decades.
Right. And then, there was the whole concern around Greece and, and of course, Italy and some of these nations that ran up huge sovereign debt, and hence it weakened the euro. And the control of that monetary policy is so integral to the health of the economy. And you see that now when it's standalone, it's the same. It's the flip side of that. It's not. It's the euro is actually stronger at the moment than the pound, but they were worried about the opposite at that point in time. So it's all it's like a fabric that's woven here. It's all these things are interrelated, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
Has Brexit been fully implemented, or are they? You're talking about the bureaucrats still trying to work through these things from a trade standpoint, but in the UK, I mean, is it day-to-day life, business, and so forth? Is it pretty much implemented?
No, I mean, in the sense that at the end of this year, there's the EU repeal law bill. So this means that any EU laws that have not been reviewed will be, automatically kind of removed. That you can imagine there's a huge amount of work that needs to happen to kind of go through all of that, because if you just remove them, there's a lot of a vacuum that's created, and there are some concerns that in doing that, protections that have been put in place because of Europe for worker protections will be removed, and that the UK is not a fairer place to do business. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that, and you can imagine just the scale of that, of like 40 years of work. Still needs to be done. So it's not finished, and I think for years there will be, the consequences are still working their way through.
Right, and this creates uncertainty in the economy, uncertainty in planning, uncertainty in capital expenditures and business and so forth. But it's ironic because, as you were saying, that it was the lower socioeconomic classes that voted to leave. In other words, to retain more of the national identity, and yet the weakness created in the economy disproportionately hurts those people.
Yeah, but the problem was, again, during the campaign, I don't think there were some erroneous claims on the Leave side, and on the Remain side, if you remember, there was more fear-mongering than talking up the benefits of the EU. And if you remember, the UK also told the EU, stay out of this. We don't want you to communicate the benefits. So, in all of this, I think there has been a lack of understanding about what the EU brought to people in the UK. And, it's trying to put a very complex issue into a binary question via this referendum with no checks, no safeguards that, has led us to where we are today.
Now, another impact has been on businesses. I think, you mentioned earlier in the conversation that London was really viewed as the capital of Europe from certainly from a finance standpoint, but also from a multinational business standpoint, and that's changed, and you see a lot of flight from London, with the banks to Frankfurt, but also multinationals have left the UK or moved their headquarters, or created counterweights on the continent as well. So that all has hurt as well.
Absolutely. I mean, there's been a huge hit. There's been huge issues for the UK economy and also for businesses. Big concerns around labour shortages and supply chains. If you remember the Dover lorry queues, that was a big shock right at the beginning. And where are all the workers to deal with this, labour shortage? Our own EU labour market report, talks about this, that the UK has more acutely this labour shortage problem because it now doesn't have access to all of these EU workers. And that's not something, even with business trying to provide higher wages or trying to improve the conditions to attract British workers, all of that is in vain, and they've still got the problem. So it's been particularly damaging. We've seen inflation. I think, some of that is linked to higher food prices. But overall, UK and EU imports have significantly declined. Many smaller companies have just stopped trading altogether. Or, like you said, firms just move their headquarters onto the continent. So again, that's a big loss.
Yeah, big loss for sure. Any final thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience?
I think, as I said earlier, the fact that there's been this cross-party summit, I do think that that's extraordinary, that there's not going to be talk of an immediate, return to the EU. But what's interesting is, on the one side, the Leavers don't want Brexit to be seen as a failure. And on the other, you've got a Labour Party that see this as a real threat to the success of any future government unless problems such as increased trade friction can be addressed. So I think there'll be a lot of behind closed doors talks about how to ensure the UK gets the best that it can out of this relationship. So there's a return to a bit more pragmatism, and that's a good thing.
So I suppose one could file this whole exercise into the file of be careful what you wish for.
And yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Sara Murray, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
And thanks to all of you for listening into CEO Perspectives. Every week I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover the leading topics in geopolitics, economics, public policy, ESG, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues, with your friends, with everyone across border. I know they're going to want to listen. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.